back to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. I'm Dr. Williams, and this is the beginning of the lecture series for Unit 2 in our class. And Unit 2 is going to focus on important skills that you'll need to develop in order to do your self-behavior modification project. So we're going to be talking about functional behavioral assessment, which goes along with Chapter 13A. Chapter 13 deals with what is a functional assessment and how we go about doing functional assessment. And you'll be doing a functional assessment on yourself for your self-behavior modification project. So I guess the first question is, what is a functional behavioral assessment, or FBA? And an FBA is the process of gathering and analyzing information about a particular client's problem behaviors and the circumstances under which they occur in order to determine the purpose or the intent of the client's actions. So it's really identifying those ABCs of behavior. By better understanding the purpose and the intent of the individual's behavior and the function that it serves, it also helps us to design an intervention strategy that will be effective in leading to behavior change and improvement. So we need to start off with the understanding that behavior doesn't occur in a vacuum. Behavior happens for a reason. Every little behavior, every single thing that we do serves a purpose. Sometimes we may not even realize what the purpose or the function of a particular behavior is. We may not really understand what the reason is for why we do something in particular. And many times the client that you'll be working with or the individual you'll be working with may not really have given very much thought to the reason why they're behaving in a certain way. Parents and teachers and caregivers and bosses might guess at the reasons, but there are often lay people, the guesses that they make are often not very specific. They may not really be sufficient in terms of a real explanation of what the behavior is, what the purpose, what the function of the behavior is serving. And sometimes they'll even be wrong. So they'll say things like, well, oh yeah, well, he does that to get attention. That doesn't tell me very much. She just enjoys being difficult. That's probably not the case. Or he's just manipulative. Oftentimes we lump all of our concerns into a simple descriptive basket, which in scientific terms may not really help us move toward an intervention that will allow for behavioral improvement. So what do we mean by behavioral functions? Well, the term function refers directly to the antecedents and the consequences of behavior. What happens immediately before the target behavior occurs and what happens immediately after the target behavior occurs. What is it about the environment or what is it about the context or the situation that gets that target behavior going? What prompts it? What's the cue? Is it the time of day? Is it an environmental situation? Is it a state that the person is in? And once the behavior occurs, what does that behavior do for the client? What do they get? How does the environment change after the behavior occurs in terms of how the environment and the individual relate to each other? Are there consequences that make the behavior very effective for that individual, even though it's not acceptable to other people? In 1994, Brian Iwata from the University of Florida and some of his colleagues conducted a functional behavior analysis to discover why individuals with developmental disabilities engage in self-harm or what's called self-injurious behavior. And so they conducted these analyses. They studied them and they looked at them. They even manipulated some variables in the environment to see whether or not they were right. And they found three major reasons that accounted for over 90% of self-injury for 152 individuals. For 152 people who were engaging in this behavior, they were able to reduce the reason for the behavior to 3 possible reasons for nearly 90% of these people. First of all was negative reinforcement. 38.1% of these people engaged in self-injurious behaviors in order to escape or avoid demands placed on them, for example, during academic situations or teaching situations or having to do chores. They engaged in self-injury, and the direct result was that they were allowed to escape the environment. 26%, a little over 26%, were responding to positive reinforcement. Self-injurious behavior led immediately to attention or access to food or toys or physical affection from the care staff. And another 25% engaged in self-injury for self-stimulatory reasons. And those 3 purposes lead to 3 very different kinds of interventions. You need to use particular interventions to deal with these kinds of consequences. And so Iwata's work helped us to discover that, in fact, not everyone engages in the same behaviors for the same reasons. Iwata said, overall, results indicated that FBA methodologies, the functional behavioral assessment methodology, these methodologies are extremely effective in identifying the environmental determinants of self-injurious behavior on an individual basis and subsequently in guiding the process of treatment selection. So functional behavioral assessment is extremely important when it comes to interventions. Many of you are going to go on to be intervention specialists in terms of your careers, and you're going to need to identify and describe those events that come before and after problem behaviors so that you can really understand what's maintaining those misbehaviors or those problem behaviors. FBA also identifies the purpose or the function of the behavior. What purpose is it serving for that person? Why do they continue engaging in that behavior? Why does that behavior work for them? And it also helps to identify possible intervention strategies and components of those strategies. So in some cases, using some form of reinforcement might help to change the behavior. In other cases, we may need to rely on punishment, or we may need to change the agents of delivery of certain consequences. There are lots of different kinds of interventions possible, and your functional behavioral assessment will help point you in the direction of more effective treatment techniques. So when we go back and define what we mean by a functional behavioral assessment, we mean an assessment method that approaches the study of behavior from the perspective of function. Not just what is the behavior, not just identifying it, but also identifying what purpose it serves for that particular individual. All behaviors serve some function, and FBA is the process of gathering information about the causes, or the antecedents, and the effects, or the consequences, of a given behavior. And it's tied directly to the ABCs of behavior. So there are some basic assumptions that go along with this approach. First of all, we assume that all behavior has a function or serves a purpose. Behaviors occur in response to identifiable stimuli and identifiable events. If we assume that we cannot identify the stimuli and events that precede and follow behavior, then it makes FBA impossible. So as a behavior analyst, I have to assume that those important critical events are identifiable. And that behaviors, the behaviors that we're targeting, are actually strengthened or weakened by the consequences that follow them. You know, the truth is, behavior is a form of communication. It's trying to tell you something. It's trying to tell you something about what that behavior is doing for that individual. What is its purpose? What's its function? And you want to look for that hidden meaning in that behavior by looking at the ABCs, the antecedents, the behavior itself, and its consequences. Misbehavior can actually be adaptive, given certain circumstances. Think about it. If a behavior allows you to escape or avoid demands by a teacher or demands by a caregiver, why would you not continue? I remember when I was in high school geometry, we had a teacher who loved to tell stories about his son who was studying geology in Alaska. And all we had to do was to raise our hand and ask questions, and we could get him off on a topic rather than having him teach geometry. So I would say probably 30% of the time we were able to escape or avoid geometry by getting him to talk about the stuff that he really liked. And then he would realize what we were doing and get mad at us, but it was always effective. So it's probably not appropriate behavior for students to try to distract the teacher, but we got very good at it. So the goal of an FBA would be to identify that function and come up with an intervention designed to reduce the frequency of that behavior. So it's very, very important. It's a very, very important part of intervention. Functional behavioral assessment gives us information about those ABCs, the who, the where, the when, and the how of behavior. Where is it happening? When is it happening? Who's involved? When does it happen? All of those things are important. Those are the cues that tell us what's coming right before, the prompts. It also tells us about the nature of behavior, its frequency, its intensity, its probability, its topography, its duration, its latency. And it tells us about the consequences, the outcomes, the immediate consequences of behavior, the reinforcers that come, the punishers that come, the effect the behavior has on other people. All of those things are provided to us through this functional behavioral assessment method. So when we work with a client, studying in detail the target behavior, we're able to gain a certain amount of information through this thorough approach. We get a lot of information about the behavior itself. We also learn about what things in the environment prompt or initiate those behaviors, what the consequences of those behaviors are. We also find out whether or not there are alternative and possibly better behaviors, more adaptive behaviors that the individual already has in their repertoire. It helps us to understand motivational variables and identify potential reinforcers that we could use in our intervention for appropriate behavior. And it also, one of the things, the interviews that we do with an FBA also help us to understand what kinds of interventions have been tried in the past and failed. So, and all of this can help shape the intervention that we develop. So remember that behavior is maintained through reinforcement. And the goal of an FBA is to identify what those reinforcers are and identify the positive reinforcers, negative reinforcers, and whether or not that reinforcement is automatic or whether it's social, so that we can go in and gain control over those reinforcers and use them to strengthen appropriate behavior rather than inappropriate behavior. There are 4 kinds of reinforcement that affect individuals' behavior. The first is social positive reinforcement. So it's reinforcement that comes from other people. It comes in the form of attention or access to activities or actual tangible reinforcers from others, whether those are hugs, whether it's the delivery of affection or actual consumable items, gifts, food. There's also social negative reinforcement through escape and avoidance. So being able to use the behavior to escape doing chores or academic tasks or get out of unpleasant interactions. And then we have automatic reinforcement that is not delivered by people, that deals specifically with sensory stimulation. So some behaviors will continue to occur because they produce pleasant or desired sensory stimulation, whether it's auditory, visual, or tactile, or whether it's consummatory in nature. So if behavior provides you with a certain kind of sensory stimulation, then you may continue engaging in that behavior. A lot of individuals with developmental challenges, or intellectual challenges, will engage in sensory stimulation. They'll body rock or manipulate their hands, shake their hands. Blinking is common, just repeated rapid blinking. And there's a sensory component to that. Automatic negative reinforcement is escaping unpleasant stimulation. So if someone is uncomfortable around cold environments, or if it gets too warm, some individuals with, for example, with autism, have an aversion to too much noise. Difficult emotions, if certain circumstances lead to negative emotions for someone, they'll work to avoid those situations. So these different kinds of functions can help strengthen behaviors that are not necessarily adaptive. By doing a functional behavioral assessment, we can identify whether any of these particular reinforcers are maintaining the target behavior, and then work to find alternative ways to produce or remove some of that, some of those reinforcing forms of stimulation. All right, well, I'm going to stop here, and we'll pick up with chapter 13b that will talk about some of the steps involved in a functional behavioral assessment, and in particular, 13b will talk about indirect behavioral assessment techniques, and then in Chapter 13c, we'll talk about more direct methodologies for conducting a functional behavioral assessment. So have a good afternoon. We'll talk to you later. Bye.